Hello there, my dear traveler. Today we are going to explore Boreas' prehistory once again. In episode 3, we're going to talk about the land diversifications. The last episode, we talked about the aquatic life in the early landforms. And now, let's dive into what the land has diversified into. Now, this is how the continents look now. They have fully merged into one single continent. Here we have the Lanesaw, Eurothea. This is a mammoth-like organism that is basically a megafauna by now. It has a very short but sharp beak that cuts through branches and stems in order to eat the nutrient-filled leaves. Similar to Cochala laevis, they decided to grow a feather-like structure around their body in order to keep themselves warm. Their two quote-unquote pedipalps have evolved into a sort of baby carrying system. Whenever they lay eggs, they'll often carry the eggs around in order to put them in a secure place. Sometimes they'll even carry their babies around, and it's a very simple parenting system, but they'll eventually let them go even before fully maturing. These organisms are found in rainforests and forest tundras, feeding on leaves of the big trees. But the creatures that live on these trees are the Truncosnap. These flying organisms have fully evolved their wings in order to fly properly, instead of just gliding from place to place. These organisms are similar to toads or frogs, where they often fly around in the air, snatching bugs in the air in order to feast on them, by snapping their trunks forward, and then grabbing onto them, and eventually swallowing them. Their shells have become segmented, however, similar to the predators of the rivers. This is so they could fly more properly, as it works similar to that of a spine. They make tiny chirping sounds similar to that of finches, but more bellowy. Their extremely strong back legs help them leap into the air so they can start flying and they can take off. But some of these bird-like organisms don't like to stay on the trees for long. The Nyxrena has evolved to be more like a rat of sorts, scuttling on the ground in order to look for food by grabbing onto them and then swallowing them whole, like that of the Truncosnap. They're slightly arboreal, having the ability to climb on trees and live on it, but they often don't really do that. Oftentimes they make tiny burrows near it, and they only go to trees in order to look for bugs in order to eat them. This burrowing habit would actually be a common trend for boreas animals that are small, as this would keep them warm and away from very strong winters, where the snow would be more harsh. These creatures would produce that of whistling noises, and not really chirping noises. This is where the burrowing trend comes into play. The mole's limax would dig into the dirt, often looking for roots to feed on. They would also come out of the dirt in order to feed on bugs. These organisms would track down their prey by using their sense of smell, which is on their pedipalps and their proboscises. They have little tiny hairs which would track down prey, or even the roots, so they can feast on it. The way they cover sand from getting into the spiracle, however, is by using little feathers that block the entrance, so dirt doesn't fall into these spiracles. The shell also aids in protecting these spiracles, and whenever dirt does get in, they often have the ability to cough it out, so they don't choke on it. Because of this eating roots behavior, if a female happens to be pregnant and they find a plant, they'll often dig out of the sand or dirt and they'll start digging into the plant. Then they'll lay their eggs in there, and when the plant finally heals, eventually those eggs would hatch and the creatures would start munching through it. This is a sort of metamorphosis type of thing where the mouths are more sharp and they have literal teeth on them. And eventually they would lose it in their adult stage due to needing to just swallow prey or roots in order to be crushed inside of the throat. Here we have our most interesting organism yet, the Osnonasum. The Osnonasum is, well, a hard-headed individual. They have this helmet of sorts which is made out of the same material as their beaks. That's because this helmet is evolved from their beaks. The reason this was evolved was to ward off predators and fight for dominance in an area, because these creatures are actually very territorial. The way they feed is by spitting saliva onto plants in order to melt them, so they can lick it up and lick that gooiness up. Now the ostinassum also has antlers too, which it uses to help with fighting against predators and also for territory. They've also developed a very loud bellows, which they use to show dominance and say, "This is my area, you should back off," or to even alert others that a predator is near the area that they are inhabiting. These creatures, however, are very territorial and are willing enough to go up to you and hit you a couple times with their head, though it isn't really fatal if they do. Now we have the Spinosaurida. These creatures have a unique sense of sexual dimorphism. Males are often more orange in color and are often smaller with shorter spines and have large wings, while females are often bigger, larger spines, and very small wings. But their colorful colors serve a purpose other than just getting mates. They also serve to ward off predators, as bright colors are a famous sign of saying, "Hey, I'm venomous." Their spines have a very potent venom that results in death most of the time. They have a new anal tract now, which they use to excrete out food that has been used already. Their feeding method is also strange too, where they use their genitals to grab stuff in the trees or bits of leaves, pull it down to the ground, and then they spit their saliva on it and then slurp it up. Here we have the ungubus. Previously a gliding parasite that would feed on the sap of plants, has turned into actually a quite helpful creature, being a pollinator as plants start flowering and growing nectar, and nectar is quite sweet. Because of this, the ungubus would rather feed on that instead of the sap, and so their proboscises have become more blunt and not really a striking spike. There is not that much unique stuff about them other than that, but they would end up becoming very viable pollinators and possibly a living fossil. Here we have the floss vase. The floss vase is a flower-like organism that has evolved its gonads to actually catch water when it's raining. Because of this, it would actually end up releasing enzymes in it that would actually make it sweet. And it's basically just glorified, slightly nutritious water. It's basically on the same level as Kool-Aid juice, but, it's natural. So, again, like the ungubus, I guess it's better. There's not really that much unique about it, other than the fact it's a flowering organism. Now here we have the Magnum folium pitcher, also known as the great leaf pitcher. The Magnum folium has a lot of leaves, and it actually ends up being a nice place for both bugs and other arboreal creatures to stay at. These creatures can take a wide variety of forms, but the thing they have in common is that they have loads of branches. Why does it have pitcher in its name? This is because its gonads are actually used to catch water when it rains. This water would, like the previous plant, would end up turning into a nice juice where spores could be released in it. This not only attracts bugs, but it also attracts other arboreal animals, like the Truncus snappus. Here we have the Radix fructus. This organism has its fruit under the ground. It may be a bad strategy because once it's eaten, it basically dies, but in the process, once it's regurgitated out, it ends up actually spreading its spores everywhere, and so because of that, they're found in massive fields of this. So they end up being a very nice hot spot for feeding. The ubiquimoss is basically an organism that grows everywhere. That's why it's called the everywhere moss also. Because of this, it's found all over the ground, and sometimes on the big plants, and even occasionally the animals. The Lacina frutex is an interesting organism as it has a lot of leaves. It looks really of this amount of small leaves, it's actually become a safe haven for smaller organisms that climb up in there to hide from predators. and it would end up becoming a spot that many bugs would retreat to if there was ever a dangerous predator nearby that they could easily be snatched up by. Here we have the fence tree. The fence tree has evolved both flowers and fruits. It has also evolved this plant
fence-like
is
leaf
often
structure.
chewed up a lot by the lane saw due to its fruits and also the flowers and nutrient-rich leaves. Well, that was certainly a bunch of organisms. Well, guess what? We're not done yet. There's still a couple of organisms we need to go through. Those were the rainforest. Now let's go to the savanna. Here we have the Locusta herba. The Locusta herba is a relatively successful organism as it's very small despite being a bite-sized little creature. It hid under the grasses, which made it very successful in the grasslands compared to other places like the tundra forests and the rainforests. They would stick their pedipalps into the ground in order to look for bugs to feast on, sifting through it, and eventually when they find a bug, they would end up grabbing it, pulling it out of the ground, and then feasting on it. They have also went through a process that is kinda similar to that of carcinization, where their tail would actually curl up behind and under their bellies. Because of this, it would be more protected and they would be kind of potato-shaped as a result. Here we have the Limax bipedalus. This creature had a long and girthy tail, which would allow it to stay balanced, and also had very strong legs, which would allow it to not only run fast, but also stay balanced. They would use both their forelegs and their pedipalps as a way to grab onto prey and then, well, pin them down to the ground for feasting. They often use their legs as a way to knock down prey in order to grab and eat them, especially if they're pretty large. They would end up evolving a sort of communication, which would allow it to basically tell other Limax bipedalists to back off and get away. This is due to the fact these creatures were territorial and they may sometimes work together to take down very big game, but this is very rare. Here we have the oculi scythe. This creature has evolved its stalk eyes in order to camouflage with the grass surrounding it. This way it could lay down and survey for predators without being spotted immediately. They have also went through a form of carcinization where their tail would curl up. They also have evolved their pedipalps to be something like horns, which they would use to hit each other in order to say, "Hey, this is my turf, get out." They have also evolved a long tongue which they would use to unroot grass or take fruit out of the plants in order to feast on them. These creatures would also have a sense of sexual dimorphism where males have shorter horns and are smaller. Here we have the mole's vitus, which is a worm-like creature that, similar to our previous mole-like counterpart, digs into the sand for burrows to find roots and other bugs. These creatures have developed 3 little feelers that they would use to sense for prey that are vibrating inside of the soil that they would crawl towards and then stab with their proboscis in order for feasting. They would also dig out of the sand occasionally to feast on the smaller plants, and sometimes they would even climb onto the cactus equivalents in order to feast on the fruits. Here we have the Imperium mandibellae. These creatures were similar to termites without a king or queen, however, but they would form in large colonies that would work together in order to get food and then put them into burrows that they could feast on when the colder parts of the years come around. They also have a pretty extreme case of sexual dimorphism where females are more tank-like and bulky while males were small and quite timid. Females were in charge of protecting the nest and finding big game to hunt, while males would just find food laying on the ground, spit on it, and then break a piece off to take back to the colony, and also just be used as mating tools. They have 2 pheromone spitters that they would use to communicate, similar to ants on Earth, that use pheromones in order to communicate and identify each other. Here we have the Siamex fugitivus. The Siamex is known for being quite the escape artist. as they would often climb onto grass in order to escape predators, and oftentimes that's very successful even for how simple it is. They also had wings which they would use to glide from plant to plant in order to stay away from the ground so that creatures don't end up finding them and feasting on them. They were, however, eaten a lot and basically the main prey. Now here we have the Lupus limax, which is a wolf-like organism that hunts in packs. They live in the north tundras, but they can be found basically everywhere except for the wastelands. Lupus limaxes had the usual hunting strategy where one would start chasing the prey to make themselves notice, the prey would run away, and a Lupus limax would be waiting in a spot. Then they would corner them, and then one of them would eventually deliver a finishing blow, killing the prey. After injecting the finishing blow, the prey would usually collapse and die due to the saliva injected inside of it, and then they would be torn and sliced open so that they could lick the gooiness inside of it for feasting. Now we have the caput bashker. This creature is also descended from the same beak helmet thing, but instead of just simply being small organisms that would probably just chase you around trying to make itself look scary, these guys were actually large and pretty scary to deal with. Same with the wolf limaxes being found everywhere except the wastelands. These creatures would often run around looking for food and then feasting on them in small herds. Instead of simply running away whenever they're chased, however, oftentimes they'll actually try to fight and kill the predator when they're attacked instead. Here we have the scythe herbert. It's a very simple plant. It's a tall, grass-like organism that has a singular leaf that it uses to photosynthesize. This very simple body plan would end up being pretty good for a while. Now here we have the famulus, also known as the waiter tree. This organism would end up developing a type of flower that could actually produce its own juices instead of catching water and releasing enzymes. A lot of creatures would be attracted to this, and it will end up becoming very successful and basically the only tree equivalent inside of the grasslands. While not usually found there, they can be found in rainforests occasionally due to how successful they are. Here we have the spina. While having thorns on its leaves in order to deter creatures, it would also offer some fruits, which creatures could happily accept instead of just feasting on the leaves. Because there's a very large rainfall in the savannas every so often, spina fruits would actually be very, very hydrational. So, if you're ever thirsty in the savannah, just look for a spina fruit. Now that is it for episode 3. On next episode, we're going to explore the sea and the fresh water. So stay tuned for that if you want to see more Boreas. Or if you don't, just get out.